The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff. Journalists usually concentrate on reporting recent events and leave the past to historians. But are they missing the bigger picture? Can we understand the present without examining its link to the past? To find out, Policy Watch is joined by Michel Martin, correspondent for ABC News and former reporter for The Wall Street Journal and The Washington Post. And now, Doug Besheroff.
Michel Martin, welcome to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
Thank you for having me.
It's a delight. You started as a print journalist. In fact, I think we first met a million years ago when you were covering the White House for the Wall Street Journal.
Yes, yeah. I actually graduated from college on June 5th, took my driver's exam on June 6th, drove to Washington on June 8th, and started at the Post on June 10th.
Wow.
My driver's license should carry a sticker warning people about that fact. So.
And it's been a lot of fun?
Yes, it's been a lot of fun. It's too much work if it weren't fun.
You made the switch from print journalism to TV.
Mm-hmm.
Why was that?
Why or how?
Why?
Why? Well, truth be told, I never intended to do this. This was not part of my big plan. In fact, for a lot of years, I didn't even own a television. I went to I went to a boarding school, which was a whole other story, how that happened. But we were not permitted to have televisions in our rooms. So I went for a lot of years without having a television and fell out of the habit of watching television. In fact, the only reason I bought a television was because I was covering campaigns. By 1988, I was covering campaigns, and it became embarrassing to go over to other people's houses to watch the debates. So I finally broke down and bought a television. And how it happened was that I was covering the White House. I was White House correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and a correspondent for one of the major networks quit suddenly. He had been in local news, and he thought he wanted to be a national correspondent, but when he got here, he hated it. His family hated it. He hated the whole thing. So they asked me if I would audition, and they were auditioning any number of people in the press corps. And the truth of the matter is, I just wanted to know what it was like to have an earpiece in my ear. That's the truth, because I sat at the White House. You have an assigned seat, and I sat behind the NBC correspondent, and I would hear them talking to somebody. This before everybody had iPods and earpieces and stuff, and people used in those wireless headsets. So this was, to me, very cool, So you'd hear people talking to somebody. I thought, who are they talking to? And they were talking to their control room, or they were talking to somebody. And I thought, that is so cool. And sometimes before a press conference, I would see them, and they would be like, blah, 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 blah. Well, I don't want to ask that, blah, 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 blah. And I thought, I wonder what that's like to talk into your ear. And they'd say, well, he's talking in my ear. And I said, I just want somebody to talk in my ear. I just want to know what that's like. So that is the truth of the matter. So when they asked me to audition, I said, sure. And I asked my boss, I said, is it okay if I do this? And he said, sure, go do your thing. His wife is in television. At the time, I worked for Al Hunt, who was the bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, and his wife, Judy Woodruff, is a terrific, very prominent correspondent for CNN, political correspondent, really one of the major figures in our business, particularly for women. Great inspiration. And he said, sure, go do your thing. And I just thought it was hilarious, and I thought it was so much fun, and I was shocked. No one was more shocked than I when they actually offered me a job, which I turned down.
You turned down?
Yes, I did, because I felt that I had a more interesting job. Actually being a print correspondent for a major newspaper, to me, offered more freedom and more latitude.
More to say. People don't realize when you're on the air, it's 90 seconds or 2.5 minutes, or whatever you do.
Yes, it's true. But if you can write a piece that, if you were to read that piece out loud, how long would it actually take to read? It was really more the freedom of movement. I mean, when I would go overseas on a White House trip, I could roam around and do whatever I wanted, whereas the television people were very much tethered to their equipment, and they were very much tethered to the body. I mean, they would literally call it, I have to watch the body. Because if something happened and they weren't physically present, if there wasn't a camera there, then, heaven forbid, they were out of business. It didn't happen. Whereas as a print person, I just felt more freedom. And at that age, And I think this is the word of wisdom. I think at that age it was more important to negotiate opportunity than salary per se. So years later...
Say that we have a lot of young people in the audience.
I think that when you're young and if you have the means to do so, I mean, if it's a matter of simple personal survival, then you obviously have to do what you have to do to sort of eat and take care of yourself. But if you have any resources at all, any latitude at all, I think that you should negotiate opportunity rather than salary. And by that I mean you should negotiate as much responsibility as you can have, as much opportunity to express yourself and to show what you can do. I tell
all the people who come to it for a job with me the same thing. Don't worry about salary. It's not important.
Right, exactly. Well, I'd have to know what they make to know whether that's a credible argument and see whether they can afford to eat, but I don't know. But anyway, years later, as the administration was winding down, another network came and offered me a different job, and at that point I took it.
This ABC?
This was ABC, yes.
And you've covered, I want to go right to a story that you covered. I think you just happened to be in New York City on September 11th. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I was actually working for at that time we had a co-production between ABC and PBS. We were working on a program called Life 360, which I hosted.
That in a minute, yeah.
And it was a quirky little show. I mean, it wasn't intended to be a big sort of hard news thing. It was very different for me. And it had music, it had interviews, it had sort of features that were off the news, but it wasn't kind of a hard news program. It was sort of stretching my legs, doing something different. And we were filming in New York because we were using an interesting space just to create a different feel from the studio that we use for our news program. And I was headed down there. A number of people on the team were already there, and I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what. I caught, my spider sense was tingling. I mean, I heard a lot of emergency vehicles heading downtown. This was in Manhattan, and our studio was in Lower Manhattan. So I saw all these vehicles heading, and they were all heading downtown. I said, something's wrong, and just then my phone rang, and one of my beautiful stepdaughters called to say, "Are you all right?" And I said, "I'm fine. Why?" And she said, "Because a plane has gone into the tower." So we immediately started running toward the office. Everybody, we were actually near our office. We started running toward the office because we wanted, it was just sort of an instinct, just wait for instructions because we didn't know exactly where we would be deployed. And so that was that. And we were there for, we were on the air continuously for about 3 days.
You went to the site of the World Trade Center?
No, we didn't go to the site. We already had people very nearby. We already had, in fact, I had one of our sound technicians was a trained EMT, and he threw down his sound pack and picked up his emergency pack and went down to the site right away. In fact, we had producers who went down there. We had one producer whose husband was already down there because he had a location down there, and she went running down there to look for him, and amazingly she was able to find him because her instinct was just to go where he was, and she found him, and they were able to report from the scene. No, I went down about 12 hours later, and I went and did the overnight. I stayed down there from about, I don't remember, maybe 8 or, I don't remember, it's all a blur, from 8 or 9 until maybe 3 or 4 in the morning, and we just took shifts. We had an apartment at an apartment building. One of our producers had found an apartment building that was just on the edge of Ground Zero that they set up as a location, and I think it may have had electricity. I think it may not. We just camped out on the floor. And
what was it like down there?
It was a scene from hell. It was a scene from hell. And I had covered disasters before. There's a different, I had covered disasters, and it's always horrible when a lot of people are experiencing pain. But there's a difference when it's a natural disaster than when it's evil, human evil, something that someone has done deliberately to hurt someone else. I think there's just something different about that. And everybody was in shock. There was the smell. I think what I still remember is the smell. That's something that television can't do, is give you the sense of the smell. And also the vastness of it. Because for all of our equipment, the sense of the vastness of it. There was this hole in the ground where a building had been, 2 buildings had been, and you knew that there were people there, and you were praying that some of those people could get out, but you probably, there was a sense that you were already in a burial ground, and it was just, it's just an overwhelming thing, and I will never forget it.
I wanted to bring up this topic because I was surprised to find out that you also covered the attempted bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993.
Yes.
And also you were in Nairobi in '98.
Yes.
Well, looking at what happened in '93, it's almost as if I know for myself, I didn't take it seriously. I would never have said, well, these people are trying to bring down the World Trade Center. And yet we now know that, I don't know whether we knew at the time, but that first bombing almost did it. It was just a few dozen feet from where it could have brought down one of the buildings.
Yes. They perfected their technique, as they are now doing in Iraq. I think that we see the lethality of these bombs is increasing as the conflict goes on. I think that's true. I think that back then there were a number of theories about who committed that bombing. I mean, there were theories that it was the Serbia, there was the conflict in the Balkans at that time. There was an early theory that it was the Serbians. There was a theory that it was a hate group. It is a hate group, just one that we had not experienced before. And I think that our government, just like a lot of us, has had a hard time wheeling around from a concept of fighting a nation state to the concept of fighting non-state actors. People just seem to have it's a cliche that you're always fighting the last war. Yeah. But there's a reason that cliches exist, because they are often true. And I think it's taken a very long time for people to understand that these are groups which are willing to operate in a very different way. They don't need a uniform. They don't need orders. They don't need a general. What they share is a common ideology and common tactics, which they share. They're like a co-op. And I think that this has been one of the major challenges of our country, because having developed itself as the preeminent nation state, we are loath to change our thinking.
Well, it's difficult, because without there being a country or a place, we have nothing to bomb, which is our usual response to these things.
But that's a relatively recent response. I mean, our technological superiority has become kind of a tactical, how can I put it?
Limitation.
Tactical limitation is right. I mean, bombs are effective when you can pinpoint a target. When the targets are living among you, that calls for different tactics. Just as you were speaking earlier to somebody we know well, a fairly prominent lawyer who happens to be my husband, and he was talking about cases that he has both prosecuted and defended. Well, I would draw the same analogies to some of the violence we see on our streets today. Some of these people we're used to these, gangs where they wear uniforms and everybody's got their handkerchief, and you think you can pick them out, and they have gang signs. Well, some of these enterprises, some of this violence doesn't arise from those factors. You have to look at different factors and come up with different solutions. And I think that we need to get smarter about recognizing the realities rather than sort of sticking to our storylines.
It will be difficult. Right now we're in the midst of trying to retool the military. At least parts of the military are trying to retool itself, and other parts of the military, not counting the Congress, where there are these vested interests in big boats and big aircraft carriers, are holding off, right, to whatever other change.
Well, this is where I think political correctness plays a role, because people are used to thinking of things as being politically correct and meaning certain things by it. But I think this is where political correctness inhibits discussion of a broad range of issues, because the idea that having a military that functions in a certain way, or talking about certain things in a certain way, inhibits discussion. I mean, I think we need free range of discussion here, which isn't licensed to be rude. It's not licensed to be racist.
What would you want to say?
But we have to speak truth. We have to speak truth about why people really do some of these things, and that's why we need to. And because until we speak truth about what motivates people, we're not really going to have effective solutions about how to address it.
And what would you put on that list?
Well, I feel particularly, perhaps as an ethnic minority in this country, that we have seen terrorism in the United States directed at ethnic minorities, and we have seen civil disorder perpetrated by minorities as a way to get the system to pay attention. And it's always after something horrible has happened that we then pay attention. And I think that we need to address the fact that people in other parts of the world feel profoundly humiliated by actions of the West. That is not a warrant to change our policies, but it is an argument that we have to address what motivates people to participate in these actions. We have to discuss what might be credible discussions about how we can address those feelings alongside our technological superiority in a military action, because the recruits never stop. I mean, like we say in the ghetto, and I see real analogies between what happens in many of our urban ghettos and what happens overseas in a way that, I mean, I sometimes have a hard time getting people to see it that way, but I see real analogies. I mean, just like the drug dealers are always recruiting, the terrorists are always recruiting. You know, if Walmart won't give you a job, the guy selling crack is going to give you a job. And if the system in Egypt or in Morocco or in Pakistan doesn't work to give you something to do that offers dignity to you, you know what? The terrorists will. And I think we need to just get more real about that.
You know, you're bringing it up that way. I think encourages me to ask the following question.
Sure.
I think you're one of our most successful black journalists. And my impression is that some of your colleagues, African American colleagues, sort of to show that they're serious, don't cover race topics.
You know, I don't find that there are enough of them that, I don't know that there are so many African American journalists that I could draw that conclusion comfortably, sadly.
But let's go to you and the fact you have tried to continue covering topics of race.
Yeah.
I think you have a continuing series on Nightline called American Black and White. How did that get started and what's it about?
The American Black and White series started as a result of the O.J. Simpson trial, because there were so many people were so shocked at the difference in reaction, or the perceived reaction, which was later validated by polling, between the way many white Americans and many African Americans viewed the events of the trial and the verdict. And that led to a sense of, you know, why is this? Why could this be? I thought that was a terrific way to start the series, because, again, you know, so often we only look at things when there's some mass riot, some huge, you know, some horrible thing, and then, and this was a horrible thing that happened to individuals. But if you could use that as a way of reflection to discuss things, I thought that was a very productive thing to do. It's like using a small argument in your marriage as a way to discuss the bigger things before you're at the lawyer's door. And I think that was a very wise thing to do, and that's how it started.
So let's talk a little bit about the O.J. So I think white Americans...
But let me just loop back to your earlier question, because I think it's a rich question. You said, do other African American journalists shy away from some of these stories? And I think that they may, and I don't fault them for that, because I don't believe, if I can say this without being hurtful to anyone, I do think that it is sometimes the case that one's skill as a journalist is not recognized if one is African American. I find that sometimes my white colleagues who undertake these stories somehow get far more admiration for doing it. It's almost as if they've mastered some obscure language, you know, like Urdu or something. So, oh my God, you actually do that, you know. Whereas if you are of color and you cover these stories, people somehow, they don't recognize that there's skill involved. It's just like, oh, well, you were born knowing this. Well, that's not true. But I still feel a sense of mission about it. But I can understand why sometimes people don't want to cover them, because they figure, well, I could go and do something else and be recognized as a journalist, as opposed to being seen perhaps as an advocate, which is annoying. But
how much
think
of that
has
is,
to do.
I understand the racial part of that. How much of that is sort of Nixon going to China?
I think it's some of that. I think there is some of that, but I also think that these are not always easy stories to talk out or think about, and I think people would like reasons not to think about them.
Now, journalism also kind of thrives on change.
Yes.
So it doesn't much matter if poverty is 40% of Americans or 60% of all Americans. It really matters if between one year to the next it went up or it went down.
That's true. It is one of the challenges of journalism as we practice it in this country. Difficult. And I think it's becoming more difficult just because it's hard. We are in an era of sort of documentaries. You know, documentaries are all the rage, but it's a particular kind of documentary. It's a polemic, you know, like a Michael Moore documentary. And, you know, he's not a journalist, and he would be the first to tell you that he's not a journalist, which I appreciate, because there are a lot of people running around calling themselves journalists who, you know, I don't think are. But I appreciate his honesty on this point. But that's it's a polemic. It's a political polemic. He's using facts to make an argument that he already believed, as opposed to accruing new facts to discover something. So it can be difficult to get the kinds of stories on that just talk about something that just is true and important but isn't new. And it is a failure of our form that we have had difficulty discovering these things. And that's why a series helps you, because it gives you an excuse to talk about something that everybody needs to talk about anyway, but there's necessarily any hook, you know. But it's just true. It's a fact. AIDS is a perfect example. we have an ongoing issue with AIDS.
Right.
But because it's a constant problem, it's become a chronic problem, not a new problem. It's difficult to talk about, but it's still really important.
You also did a program on lynching.
Yes.
And that's an old problem.
Yes.
And it took a long time for you to get it completed and on the air.
4 years.
And what was the storyline?
Well, the story, the excuse was that, which is called a news peg, you know. The nice way to say it is a news peg, and the not nice way, it's an excuse to get something on the air that you want to talk about. And there was an archivist in the Georgia area who has been collecting artifacts of lynchings for years. He's actually an antiques dealer and stumbled upon this, didn't know what these things were, started collecting some sense that they might be important. And he finally was ready to make his collection available for public viewing. So that was the excuse, hence Newspeg, to put this thing on. What made it so difficult, well, there's a lot of reasons it was difficult to get on the air, but we finally got it on the air because the Senate brought forward an apology, which was a resolution to apologize for its failure to pass anti-lynching legislation all those years ago when it might have made a difference. And now, of course, it's a purely symbolic act, but I believe symbolism has meaning, so that was the reason we got it on. And why does that matter? Well, you know, we could argue about that. I mean, there are people who would legitimately argue and say, you know, why are you ripping off these old scars and let these things heal? My feeling is we've never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country, like some countries who have had to deal with ethnic violence in their past. South Africa has had that. You see in the Balkans there's an effort to use words and public discussion as a vehicle for healing. We've never had that. We've had some trials where we basically take a few people and we hold them accountable for the actions of the many. And I think that public discussion is our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that's why I believe it has value. And if those people don't agree, I understand it, but that's why, you know, you're not under subpoena when you watch television.
You'll keep looking for those news pegs.
That's right.
But they are sometimes awkward.
Yes.
We shared one, and you may or may not remember.
I don't.
I was pitching it's like that.
As much as I hang on your every word,
thank you
somehow...
so much. But we had talked a number of years ago about the plight of inner city black boys. And I think you were interested in trying to do something. And nothing came until Columbine.
Right.
And so there was the news peg. You got me on the show, but what did we talk about? A bunch of white kids, right?
Right.
So.
Well, I actually did wind up being able to use that as a news peg eventually. But this is where, you know, you have to have a long memory and some patience, because the following year, the year after Columbine, I did a program pegged to Columbine about the number of kids who were murdered in the District of Columbia over the course of the year, which exceeded the number of kids who had been killed at Columbine.
But it takes creativity to kind of get those pegs.
Sure. So we did one show on the Columbine anniversary, and then the following day we did the show about the district, and we called the other Columbine. But thank you for remembering that.
Well, most important date I ever had. You've talked about looking back, about our racial troubles. And other people are talking about looking forward, moving past that. And I suppose one of the most famous people trying to do that now is Bill Cosby. And you've interviewed him. What's going on?
Well, first of all, I don't think that looking forward and looking back are at odds with each other, because oftentimes present circumstances are rooted in past behaviors, which totally. I think do need to be unpacked, I think, or that's just my view of the matter. That's the only reason to do it, is if it has some present utility. Because it's simply a matter of picking at old sores. You know, why bother? One has to believe that there's some present utility and future hope that comes from releasing old hurts. I think that's one reason to do it. But if you're, what are you interested in? What Cosby's doing? Or are you interested in what's? Well, it's very interesting. He a year ago, and the 50th commemoration of the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Ed, which is looking back, offered what I think some would call a pointed critique, what others would call a dyspeptic rant, where he talked about what he called the lower economic people not holding up their end. You know, and factually, it is accurate to say that, for example, if you compare married couple black families with married couple white families, they have almost achieved income parity. So wherein lies the disparity between the overall fortunes of African Americans and the overall sort of fortunes of white Americans? Well, some of it, of course, has to do with assets accumulated in earlier generations, which are being passed down, which was not available to African Americans. But if you just look at present effort, it has to do with a lot of things going on in the community that are making it hard to advance. And so what he was saying is that, enough already about big social policies. Let's talk about personal behavior. Let's talk about what you're adding to this, and let's talk about what we can do about that. So it was a very rich discussion. It's frankly something that you could hear in many African American churches any Sunday of the month, if one would care to go. But he brought this to a broader discussion, and because of his stature, he is still. I was interested to know America's #1 TV dad. And I think it was two things. It was both the contrast between kind of the anger and intensity of his words and the kind of the sweetness of his public image. It was also what he said. He was so blunt about it that I think set people on his ear. But what was interesting to me is not just that he gave one speech, because, anybody can give a speech, but that he has gone on around the country in different cities, meeting with people, basically having town meetings, where he talks to people about these issues and talks to them as opposed to about them. And that's what we covered. It was a very interesting discussion. It was not an easy discussion, because he did not really enjoy being challenged, which I found interesting. But wonder why.
Michel Martin, thank you very much for coming to the University of Maryland.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance, and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.